I think the Russians had this weird plan in a cabinet. If Ukraine should be about to join NATO, that they might take Crimea to protect Sevastopol, which was their big Black Sea Fleet port, which they've had since 1790 something or other. Look, I was in Crimea in the old days, and it is very much Russian. But the fact of the matter is, it was handed over in this internal nonsense thing to Ukraine by the Ukrainian-born Nikita Khrushchev when everyone thought the Soviet Union would last forever. And the issue really becomes one of international law and international borders.
This morning, we are focusing on what is happening next in Ukraine, and it's one of the stories that has dominated the news agenda for some time. President Trump has lashed out at Volodymyr Zelensky. The US president said a peace deal was very close, but accused Zelensky of harming those negotiations. Trump wrote on social media that the Ukrainian president was making inflammatory comments by refusing to accept Russian sovereignty over Crimea.
The growing anger with Ukraine seems to explain why the summit in London yesterday was downgraded, with senior Americans refusing to attend. Later on, President Trump explained his thinking. He was in the Oval Office of the White House.
I think we have a deal with Russia. We have to get a deal with Zelensky, and I hope that Zelensky, I thought it might be easier to deal with Zelensky so far. It's been harder, but that's okay. It's all right. But I think we have a deal with both. I hope they do it because I'm looking to save. And, you know, we spend a lot of money, but this is about a lot of humanity. This is the worst. I get the pictures, the satellite pictures. I've never seen anything like it. Of the fields after some of these battles. It's horrible that it's going for nothing. We would have never had this problem. You would have never had that war if I were president. I guarantee you that. And for 4 years, you didn't have it.
It's an unprovable point, that, and it's a point that he continues to make, that if he'd have been president, it wouldn't have happened. And you can't actually deny that, even if you're suspicious of it. Russia's attacks, of course, go on. Kyiv was targeted last night. There's lots more of that to come, lots of explosions and bombs exploding there all across the city and other parts of Ukraine.
More than 50 people were injured in that attack, including 6 children last night. Well, Stephen Erlanger is the New York Times chief diplomatic correspondent in Europe and joins us now. Good morning.
Good morning.
Let's talk about the negotiations, or what Donald Trump is proposing happens next on this deal between Ukraine and Russia. The main sticking point, it seems to be the issue of Crimea. How realistic is it, do you think, that Crimea could ever be returned to Ukraine?
I think it's very difficult to imagine, but everyone said the same about Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia after they were annexed by the Soviet Union. It took 50 years, something like that, but off they went back again. It probably would require another implosion in Russia, which is not too hard to imagine down the road, by the way. But no, I mean, at this point, it's almost impossible to imagine, partly because the Russians have already driven out of Crimea people who support Ukraine. They've jailed them, they've deported them, and many of them have actually left. So the current population of Crimea, I think you could say, is there because it is pleased or happy or content enough to live under Russian control.
I mean, one of the points that Donald Trump is making is that at the time when Russia first made this incursion into Crimea, that nobody stood up, nobody fought for that territory, and therefore this was a battle that was lost long ago. Is that a fair point to make, do you think?
Not entirely. I mean, I was there in 2014. I was in the Maidan, and look, there were Russian troops all over Crimea. The Ukrainians, you know, it was a big Russian naval base. That was the whole point. So Russia already had lots and lots of troops there. The Ukrainian defenses were aimed outward, not inward. I think the Russians had this weird plan in a cabinet. If Ukraine should be about to join NATO, that they might take Crimea to protect Sevastopol, which was their big Black Sea Fleet port, which they've had since 1790 something or other. Look, I was in Crimea in the old days, and it is very much Russian. But the fact of the matter is, it was handed over in this internal nonsense thing to Ukraine by the Ukrainian-born Nikita Khrushchev when everyone thought the Soviet Union would last forever. And the issue really becomes one of international law and international borders. Now, wars change borders, so if Crimea gets annexed by Russia, well, the Sudetenland got annexed after the German loss in World War II. So these things happen, but having all these Europeans and previous American administrations say the principle of unchanging borders in Europe, founded in the Helsinki Accords, et cetera, and in promises Russia itself made in the early 90s, if those matter at all, then Crimea should at least de jure remain Russian. Now, what the Americans are saying is we'll recognize Russian control over Crimea, but Ukraine doesn't have to, which is a very odd way of putting it.
Yeah, and doesn't feel like it will resolve the issue at all in any sense of the word. Finally, I mean, obviously that Donald Trump has posted on Truth Social overnight. He's had some very tough words for President Zelensky. He's also basically threatening to pull away from this agreement. How realistic do you think that is? And what's motivating him now in this renewed push for a deal, do you think?
Well, some of it's just frustration. Trump gets frustrated. If you remember, he was going to solve the North Korean problem, and then it got frustrating, and so he just walked away from it. He may do the same. I mean, it does cost Americans quite a lot of money. It wasn't very clear how much more money was going to be coming anyway. He wants to do deals with Vladimir Putin. He has this relationship with Putin that is quite strong. He's bought Putin's narrative on Ukraine. He's hated Zelensky ever since Zelensky was a part of Trump's first impeachment procedure in his first term. And he wants Ukraine aside so he can deal with Russia. Now, if Europe wants to help Ukraine, it's fine with him. And I think this will be a big test for Europe, because my sense is, he's done a deal with Putin. Putin doesn't really want the war to end much right now either, but he's done a sort of deal with Trump. Trump wants to impose it on Zelensky. I think Zelensky politically would find it impossible to agree, so the war will go on.
Or Zelensky may well leave. Is that a possibility?
It doesn't feel like it now, because there's not going to be an election under wartime. I mean, so elections have been postponed in Ukraine. I mean, it could be he's thrown out of office in a coup of some kind, but I don't see him leaving anytime soon, no.
Stephen, thank you so much for your time this morning. Great to get your perspective.
Thank you.
That is Stephen Erlanger there, the New York Times chief diplomatic correspondent in Europe.
Whenever you talk to people who know a lot about this, it just feels so far away, doesn't it? You can have people being optimistic. And I wonder at some point whether the UK government is going to have to smell the coffee here, that Crimea is never going back to Ukraine in the short term. Trump is never going to offer security guarantees to Ukraine. Putin is never going to give up a lot of land he's taken. And therefore, there's just a reality check here, isn't there? That either you say to Ukraine, we are going to fight your war with you for the next few years.
Which we're not going to say. Or there is going to be a horrible compromise. I mean, the way Trump behaves on this, I think, is, to many people, I would include myself in this, disgraceful. But there is a hard reality that he's butting against, which is Crimea's not going anywhere. Russia's not going anywhere. How do you get to an end point? And we've had 3 years of being soft-soaped, haven't we, by people in Ukraine understandably saying we can win at all costs, and people in the UK saying, oh, Ukraine will win. And that was never going to happen. But does that mean we just have to accept what America doles out to us? Well, I think that the definition of what a win is has never really been clear here, because it was never going to be the case that Ukraine would be able to push Russia out of all of the territory that it had taken without the direct intervention of other powers, and that has not been forthcoming. So I think you're right. It is a reality check moment. The big question for Europe, as Stephen was saying there, is how willing are we to put lives on the line, but a lot of money on the line too. There has been some increase in spending from Europe, but not anywhere near enough to compensate for America walking away.
If your view on Ukraine has changed over the last, let's say since the Trump administration, so let's go from January this year, 2025, has your view on the Ukrainian conflict, on our level of support for it, has it shifted? Has it shifted more than once? I just wonder whether, because this is about our country's support. Do we gear ourselves up for effectively being full members of a land war in Europe? Or do we follow the American lead and let it all rather lapse? 0333003233. It's interesting to get your thoughts as we move along with this. You know, is your view on Ukraine changing as President Trump endlessly bangs the same drum on the subject? It's 6:16. Thousands are now queuing in the Vatican to pay their respects to the late Pope. His funeral is on Saturday. We're going to go live to the queue. I'm fascinated by the queue. It was the most interesting thing about the Queen Elizabeth dying. I think it's so interesting how people respond to major events. Russia's also sanctioned 15 UK MPs for hostile statements to the Kremlin. We can't have that, can we?